Good morning and welcome everyone to our Rural Broadband Solutions, How to Quickly Close the Gap webinar. Today, I'd like to introduce our host. Today's webinar will be hosted by Matt Polka, President and CEO of ACA Connects, and Vanessa Cinders, Senior Vice President of Administration and Congressional Affairs. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Matt Polka.
Thank you, Nilda. It's great to be here with you today and with everybody else. ACA Connects represents more than 700 plus small and medium-sized broadband providers. Most serve fewer than 1,000 customers, and most serve in rural areas and smaller communities. If there's one hallmark about ACA Connects members, it's that they are part of their communities, serving their friends and neighbors, their schools, healthcare facilities, and workplaces. For them, taking FCC Chairman Pai's Keep Americans Connected pledge was really just doing business as usual. In all, over the past decade, our members have invested more than $10 billion in their broadband networks as they respond to consumer demands and competitors. Virtually all have deployed sophisticated DOCSIS networks, and many provide gigabit service. And they continue to invest enormous amounts annually to upgrade their network capabilities. It thus should come as no surprise that during the COVID-19 emergency, not one of our members' networks wasn't up to the task of providing the performance broadband-wise that their customers needed. Our members have also invested greatly to expand the reach of their networks, including into unserved areas. One factor in making this possible was the work of the FCC to reduce barriers to deployment, and it is critical, as you will hear discussed further today, that this work continues. The more that we can facilitate network expansion into unserved areas without spending any federal funds, the more we can target limited federal funds to the areas that need them most and for other purposes. Our members also see an opportunity to use their experience with rural builds to participate in federal funding programs. In fact, many of our members participated in the Connect America Fund auction, and many won. Many more are seeking to participate right now in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and about 27% of all interested bidders are ACA Connects members who are likely to win, and I expect many of them will win because of the fact that they will be providing high performance, even gigabit service. Of course, so much more needs to be done to close the urban-rural digital divide and ensure that all the needs of individuals and households have access to high performance broadband so that they can engage fully in telework, telehealth, online learning, and many other activities. But how do we get from here to there? Well, let me quickly provide a path. First, we need better data about locations that don't have high performance broadband connectivity. The FCC is moving ahead with this task, and Congress needs to provide funding to make this possible. Second, this is very important, we cannot undermine the market. Every year, driven by consumers and competitors, the private sector invests 10 times more than all governments in aggregate. And by permitting this to continue, we can reach our goal much, much sooner. And the more we rely on private investment, the more money that we can free up to expedite deployment into unserved areas, and the more we can spend for adoption programs. Third, government should continue to reduce barriers to deployment, thereby lowering the costs of builds. Fourth and finally, where locations remain so high cost and unserved, government should provide support efficiently and effectively and give in-need people the means to connect to high-performance broadband where those wireline broadband services exist. By nature, I'm an optimist, and I see what our ACA Connects members are doing each and every day, as well as other ISPs across the country, meeting the broadband need in their communities. And I'm confident that by learning the lessons we've learned to date And by joining in a concerted effort, we can close the digital divide and ensure that everyone is connected with high-performance broadband. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And now let me introduce Vanessa Cinders, Senior Vice President of Congressional and Administrative Affairs for Charter Communications. Vanessa?
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vanessa Cinders, and I lead Charter's Federal Legislative Affairs team in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today to share some ideas about how we can increase access to broadband in rural areas. Charter is a connectivity company that provides broadband, video, mobile services across 41 states with over 30 million customers and 95,000 employees. As the coronavirus pandemic has swept the country, the need for a fast internet connection has become critical to our ability to work, learn, and receive healthcare. Unfortunately, and despite significant ongoing efforts, millions of Americans are still without adequate service to engage in these activities. Over the last several months, Charter provided free broadband to over 400,000 teachers, students, and their families, as well as small businesses, and we also have been investing in and expanding our network to reach more of the millions of homes and businesses without broadband. We know that one of the most important things broadband providers like Charter can do is keep connecting more communities. Connectivity is a game changer. By bringing high-speed broadband access to more people, we are empowering them to find the opportunities they need to thrive in the 21st century, regardless of whether they live in a small town or an urban center. That drives economic growth and powers opportunity, leading to a stronger, more accessible economy. Charter is proud to be a part of that. Over the last 5 years, Charter has invested nearly $40 billion in technology and infrastructure. In just the last 2 years, we built out our network to more than 1.5 million unserved or underserved homes and businesses, about 1/3 of which was in rural areas. One of the obstacles that can delay broadband infrastructure build-out, especially in rural areas, involves the complicated process for broadband providers like us to obtain permission to attach their cables to utility poles. With fewer homes and businesses in these areas, broadband providers need to access multiple poles per home as opposed to multiple homes per pole in urban areas. You are going to hear more about this policy issue and others, and an immediate action the FCC could take to clarify its existing pole rules to eliminate this barrier to deployment. Charter is committed to helping to close the digital divide, and we're excited to participate in today's discussion about how we can make it happen faster. And with that, I am going to turn the floor over to our esteemed moderator, Joanna McIntosh, Senior Vice President for Government Affairs from NCTA, who is going to lead this great discussion. Joanna? Joanna, are you still on mute? We'll get you off of mute so you can get things started.
Great, thank you. So good morning, everybody. Joanna McIntosh. I lead the government relations team here at NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. We represent both technology innovators and great creators, the providers that build innovative, powerful technology platforms, and the programmers that create the most exciting content. Today, we're going to be focusing on our broadband providers. I want you to know that we're really committed to helping bridge the rural broadband gap. You might be surprised to hear that our government relations team spends more time working on this issue than any other. I would hazard a guess that in the last 2 years of this Congress, we have probably worked with more than 25 different member offices on broadband legislation. So if you're working on the Hill or in a third-party organization and you have some ideas for broadband legislation that you want to kick around, we'd love to work with you to do that. And I think you'll find a lot of great ideas in our panel today. So Sam and Christian, why don't we get underway and let the panelists into the Zoom chat room. Welcome, Michelle. Welcome, Marita, Brian, Katie, and we have 2 more. While we're waiting for them to join, just want to let our audience know that we're going to start today by giving each of our 5 panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves, to tell us about their interest or their organization's interest in accelerating rural broadband deployment, and to describe some of their work to achieve that goal. I'm going to turn the floor over first to Marita, who's the Vice President and CEO of MMTC, the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. And Marita, you've got 4 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Joanna, so much. I really appreciate NCTA and Charter for allowing MMTC to participate in this important conversation about how to close the rural broadband gap. MMTC has actually advocated for providing for affordable broadband access, closing the digital divide. We've testified before Congress. We've routinely filed comments with the FCC. We communicate with FCC commissioners regularly on broadband connectivity, access, deployment, and literacy. And we engage with congressional offices on proposals to support broadband access for underserved groups. That's our lane, is really focusing on underserved and marginalized groups. In this pandemic, connectivity is even more important now than ever. But there are actually vast swaths of the country that lack access to broadband connections. Recently, MMTC led a 27-member coalition in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund proceeding at the FCC. We were encouraging the commission to take proactive steps to further broadband deployment in rural areas. And so why are civil rights groups interested in rural broadband? I don't know that most people realize this, but 26.4% of the United States rural population doesn't have broadband, and racial and ethnic minorities, including African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans, make up 22% of America's rural population. So MMTC has been focused on rural broadband. We've been weighing in at the FCC since the proceedings that started in the early 2000s. Over 900 communities with populations of less than 25,000 are composed primarily of African Americans, and there are nearly 1,000 rural communities of less than 25,000 that are primarily Hispanic. A lot of these communities are very low income and urgently in need of economic opportunities that could help them if they had high-speed broadband. For the families living in those communities, bringing reliable high-speed internet to their communities would bring the potential for new education, job, entrepreneurial, and other opportunities to help them to have achieved economic mobility. So MMTC is weighed in on lots of things, but in this instance, what I'd like to talk about are a couple of things. One is that we recently supported the NCTA's proposal to clarify the FCC's pole attachment rules. For those of you who aren't that familiar with poles, controlling the cost of pole attachments and resolving pole attachment disputes between broadband providers and utility companies is a huge thing. The FCC administers the regulations that govern who pays and how much has to be paid to attach to utility poles. However, disputes arise because pole owners routinely shift the entire cost of pole replacement onto the new attachers instead of just the cost of making the attachment. So for rural communities, this adds added burdens and delays that resulting from these disputes, and it slows down the ability to have a reliable internet connection. and eliminate the digital isolation that's going on in some rural communities. So for the poll attachments proceeding, MMTC led an 18-member coalition. We filed comments with the FCC advocating supporting NCTA's proposal to clarify the rules, to prioritize poll attachment disputes, and to accelerate broadband deployment in rural. And if I may say, it wasn't difficult to get other civil rights and social justice groups to understand the direct correlation between added poll attachment and poll replacement costs and the cost of broadband. They get passed on to the consumer, and their delays also contribute to the lack of broadband deployment and the cost. And it's just one of many other issues affecting the digital divide that MMTC weighs in on. And on a personal level, having recently witnessed the full replacement of the utility pole in front of my home, I know that replacing a pole is no small matter. We've also weighed in on Congressman G.K. Butterfield's of North Carolina's bill. It's called Expanding Opportunities for Broadband. We support that legislation, which would suspend the ETC eligibility requirement for the duration of this pandemic. And what that means is just that carriers who are, and it especially affects small carriers who are trying to provide lifeline, low-income lifeline and E-rate service for low-income consumers would be relieved of the obligation to get this eligible telecommunications carrier designation from either a state or from the FCC. That's a very time-consuming process, and as I said, it puts an additional burden on small businesses. So we also weighed in, as I said, on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. We had a coalition of 27 civil rights and social justice groups weigh in on that. So in closing, MMTC believes it is vital that we address the digital divide, that we connect families to the support that they need. We know that no path is a fix-all, but every action we take can make a huge difference on many lives. So we look forward to working directly with members' offices to engage on these issues to make sure that everyone has the support and the connectivity they need in these unprecedented times. Thank you, and I look forward to speaking with you a bit later.
Great, thank you, Marita. Next, we're going to go to Dr. Michelle Connolly, who's the professor of the economics practice at Duke University, and not only knows her way around econometric analysis, but also really important rural broadband issues. Dr. Connolly.
Thank you very much. So, as Joanna said, I am from Duke University, but nothing I say here represents Duke's opinions. They're just my opinions. And I have worked in the past with NCTA on a poll attachment study. The key thing that, as an economist, I felt I have to bore you a little bit with some slides. So I'm going to work hard at that. But the main point I wanted to make in terms of the issue of rural broadband is really that when we're looking at deployment decisions, they're not done in a vacuum. Anytime an internet service provider or broadband provider is deciding where to invest, they can invest in different activities as well as different locations. So they can think about, I have money to improve broadband in existing locations, and then they still need to choose what those are, or I can deploy to new locations. And when they're deciding where to deploy, then they're going to look at the relative attractiveness of different locations. And that's going to be based on where they think they're going to get the highest return. Can we switch to the next slide? So I've broken this up in terms of factors, both on the revenue side and the demand side. Here, I'm just focusing on the revenue side. Expected revenue is influenced obviously by the population passed, but also by the expected take-up rate. Not every household passed will necessarily become a broadband subscriber. How much a broadband firm might expect to have as a take-up rate is going to depend significantly on the cost they're offering, the quality. It also depends on socioeconomic factors. The Pew Center has showed through a lot of surveys that there are many factors that affect even if broadband is accessible, whether or not people take that up. And the factors can include age, income, education, or perceived relevance. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that one of the issues in the rural areas is not only that it has less population, but there's on average lower take up in rural areas. So that's another factor affecting the returns to broadband investment in more rural areas. And then the take up rate is also impacted by existing and or potential competitors. So even if a broadband firm might be the first to be coming in and offering broadband, if there's an existence of local utilities who might become internet providers in the future, that can have an impact on the decision for a firm to come into that location. Next slide, please. But most of the things I mentioned on the revenue side are fairly standard in terms of rural broadband, and at least the things that we're discussing today don't necessarily impact those. This slide here, where I'm focusing more on expected costs, is more at the heart of the issue that we're trying to talk about today. Deployment costs are enormous and clearly are influenced by population density. In rural areas, we have already mentioned several times that you'll need more poles in order to reach the average consumer in a rural area. So population density inherently increases deployment costs. But because it influences poles, it also influences annual costs, since there are also pole attachment rates involved that are annual. There can also be imposed costs. And when I say imposed costs, I mean beyond the normal market costs, or at least these are things that have been pointed out in the public record. So delays in extensive delays for applications, surveys, or make-ready delays, requests for attachers to cover the full pole replacement costs for aged poles, which is oftentimes the case in a rural setting. Those all increase the imposed costs that a broadband provider might be trying to include. Charter, in fact, testified that in one rural expansion, they recently had pole replacement costs ended up being about 25% of their total cost of deployment, including everything else that might be standard. So this is not an insignificant issue for rural areas, especially when the notion is that attachers should be only charged for the components that are required because of their attachments. So not necessarily the full replacement cost of a new pole, especially if the pole was already due to be replaced later. In terms of the annual costs, there are regular costs such as administrative costs, but pole attachment costs end up being very important to this issue. And I'll use an example that actually came from NRECA, a white paper. They were using this as an example where it really wasn't a big issue. Not a big issue for the fact that Virginia pole was charging, Virginia Co-op was charging $20.60 for pole attachment rates per pole per year. So I used their example. They said 30 poles per mile and 8 electric customers per mile. Now, using the NCTA data that I had studied before, the average IO utility charged $7.40 per pole per year. So that's a difference of over 13.
Tell us what an IO is.
Oh, investor-owned utility. Sorry. So that means that depending on whether you were deploying in an area with an investor-owned utility in Virginia versus, say, this area with the co-op that was charging $20, you'd be paying a difference per year of about $13.20. So that's an extra cost of almost $400 per mile per year. Even if we assume 100% take-up of the electrical customers, so even if all 8 of these customers on a mile took up broadband service, that would be an extra cost of almost $50 per year per customer. More realistically, something like 75% take up of electric customers, then that's a cost of $66 per broadband customer per year. So when a broadband firm is deciding what locations to invest in, these things make huge differences to the marginal choice between locations. And in particular here, both when we're talking about replacement costs and attachment costs, they multiplicatively impact rural broadband. So if they are just, even if it's only a few dollars more, and that might be true throughout the country, if it's in a rural area, that's going to be multiplied by many miles and many poles and many miles, therefore creating a much greater impact. Last slide, please. So a broadband provider has the most control when they are deciding, at the time when they're deciding where to deploy. And that's the key for the question today, is what kind of policies make those decisions end up not being in the most unserved areas. So we know that in rural areas, there are going to be higher deployment costs, and certainly many operational costs will generally be higher per household passed in rural areas. That's just the nature of the geography and the location. However, any artificially inflated deployment or operational costs, which increase with distance, such as the pole replacement costs, the pole attachment costs, those multiplicatively increase expected costs in rural areas relative to urban and suburban areas. So at the margin, this skews deployment away from the rural areas that need it the most, and fundamentally slows the closing of the digital divide that we would have otherwise. That's all I have.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. That was really very helpful. So next we're going to move to Brian Hurley, who's Vice President, Regulatory Affairs for ACA Connects.
Thank you, Joanna. It's a pleasure to be here today. So, as ACA Connects President Matt Polka just explained, broadband deployment in the United States is a success story, and ACA Connects members have played a significant role in achieving that success, especially in rural areas. But even with all the progress that's been made over the last 12 years by Democratic and Republican policymakers alike, and you should applaud yourself for what's been achieved, there's much more that all of us can do to close the digital divide in rural America. So in his remarks, Matt outlined a path forward for getting us there, and I'd like to talk further about some of the different steps along that path. First is broadband mapping. We need to accurately identify the locations that are unserved if we want to target those areas effectively. Congress and the FCC have worked diligently on this issue, and the FCC is in the process of creating a data collection that is more granular than what exists today. Upon completion, for the first time, we'll be able to identify unserved locations in partially served census blocks and to be able to target those locations for support. We applaud that work, and we believe that better mapping can be achieved in a way that takes into account the unique challenges and burdens that smaller broadband providers face. The second step is that we should foster and sustain a regulatory environment that is conducive to broadband deployment. Over the past decade, the private sector has invested over $750 billion to build robust, high-performance broadband networks. And with competition intensifying and consumer demand increasing, that trend shows no sign of stopping. The government's top priority in addressing rural broadband gaps should be do no harm. After all, when private investment is brought to serve an unserved location, that frees up limited government support that can be used to bring service to areas that remain unserved, or that could be used to foster adoption. By the same token, policymakers should continue to remove barriers to deployment. We'll hear more today, and we've actually heard some already, about the importance of utility pole access and the challenges that broadband providers face in attaching their equipment to investor-owned utility poles. For instance, as we've heard already, broadband providers seeking to attach to poles are often forced by the utility to pay the full cost of replacing a pole, even though the utility also benefits from the replacement. Along similar lines, ACA Connects members are experiencing problems being able to install customer connections quickly due to restrictions by the utility. And ACA Connects members frequently tell us that they face restrictions in crossing railroad rights of way. Removing barriers such as these can go a long way to encouraging rural broadband deployment. Unfortunately, even after taking these first two steps, the marketplace may not be able to provide broadband to Americans living in the most remote and hard to serve locations. So the next step in the path that we need to take is to use the FCC's new improved maps to identify the remaining unserved locations and then disperse government support in a targeted and cost-effective way that can provide future-proof connectivity. Not only will future-proof broadband give rural consumers the tools they need to fully participate in our 21st century economy and society, it will be a wise long-term investment. As we've learned from the past, spending government funds for barely adequate broadband service that will need to be upgraded in just a few years is a losing proposition. And then going beyond deployment, we need to solve another part of the broadband puzzle, adoption. We support the creation of programs that would enable in-need, disadvantaged consumers and households to receive the necessary support to subscribe to broadband service that is sufficiently robust and high capacity to meet their needs. We also support enhancing broadband adoption through increased education and training, and by providing in-need and disadvantaged consumers with the equipment necessary for connectivity and access. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of ACA Connect's ideas on how to close the rural broadband gap, and I'll look forward to questions.
Great, thank you, Brian, and we'll be back shortly with some questions. Let's turn next to Katie McAuliffe, who's the driving force of ATR's Digital Liberty Program. Welcome,
Hey there,
Katie.
thanks so much for having me today. Really wonderful topic to talk about closing this digital divide that we have. You know, the last 6% of Americans who don't have that opportunity to connect to broadband. It's so important, and this FCC has done a lot to throw different options into the mix and different ways to connect. But, you know, thanks to recently the 1.7 trillion in investment into broadband networks, we've got 94% of our population connected, and about 80% of the population has the option to access gigabit speed. So this is really quite an accomplishment. And, you know, when we're looking at where those last bits of connectivity come into play, there are lots of barriers we can bring down so that the private sector can step in. Now, again, I am Katie McAuliffe, and I'm the Executive Director of Digital Liberty, which is a sister organization of Americans for Tax Reform. But I want to highlight a report by my colleague, Margaret Muir, who works on a lot of our state issues. And this report is 6 things states can do to promote private sector investment in broadband. And what's really nice about this report is it looks into the state process, but a lot of these run parallel to what can be done at the federal level and things that are happening at the federal level. So one of those things to start out with is eliminate tax on capital expenditures for communications equipment. This is something that a lot of you can be familiar with or may be familiar with when we did tax reform. And that includes reducing those inputs so that states can deploy more. Now, an example from the states, if all states eliminated this tax on network investments, those investments would increase across the country by about 9.4%. It might sound small, but it's actually $4 trillion in network investments that could go up. And capital expenditures taxes are kind of bad policy because it's part of business inputs. So it's sort of, it leads to tax pyramiding, it encourages vertical integration, it hides the true tax burden from taxpayers, and ultimately results in higher prices for consumers, higher prices for deploying broadband. So that's something that Congress can definitely look at. A lot of panelists have talked about lowering franchise fees and access to rights of way. That's a very important aspect. That's something else that's covered in the report. Streamlining the permitting process in a technology neutral way. This is really important for getting deployment out of all of the different types of opportunities to access the internet. And that's a very important process. And as many of the panelists have mentioned, so I'm just going to skip over this, but we also cover in the report talking about making pole attachments less costly and complicated. Another big one is saying no to government-owned networks. These are sometimes called municipal broadband or GONs. Those government-owned networks, they may sound attractive, but from our research and over time and looking at the many instances, those fail, and they often compete with networks that are already deployed. So rather than connecting people who do need to be connected to the internet, who don't have any options, you end up competing with folks who already have options. So if our goal is closing that digital divide in the last 6%, then that's really what we want to focus on. Another thing that we point out is to put guardrails around broadband funding programs. So when you look at grants or other programs, we really think those should be awarded through a competitive reverse auction and in a process that is, of course, technology neutral. And has been mentioned already, a couple of ways to move this direction are we have seen the idea of competitive reverse auctions in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF. And that helps us maximize those dollars so that there are more people able to compete in the process, people who have that experience, people who can build out the last mile, who have adjacent networks that are just building into those rural areas. That's really helpful for the folks there. And then also that eligible telecommunications carrier requirement in order to participate in these types of funds or grant programs is really a problem, because when you think about now, a lot of us I don't have a phone on my wall. I don't have plain old telephone service anymore. And that's a requirement in order to participate in a lot of these programs. You have to provide some kind of plain old telephone service. And a lot of people don't want that. A lot of people just want access to broadband and high-speed data. So removing that credit or that requirement would be really, really helpful in having more people participate in the process. And the more people you participate in a process with a competitive reverse auction, you bring down or you expand the amount of available dollars and increase the amount of competition. So you really do get more bang for your buck out of that. So we released this paper because this is a great time to talk about this. Coming out of coronavirus and seeing how important our internet connectivity really is. American networks are very strong and have been doing well, but of course we can always do better. And in these ways, government can kind of step out of the way, can help the private sector unleash a lot more capital, a lot more power, and get more folks connected at a reasonable rate and very cost effective. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Great, thank you, Katie. And so now we're going to close out our opening remarks with Mark Paul, Vice President of Policy at Charter Communications.
Thanks, Joanna. Great, really appreciate the opportunity to join the panel today. And I'm really, really excited to talk about how we can get more of America connected to broadband. I think it's such an important topic. It's a high priority for the company that I work for, Charter Communications. So really excited to be here today. I think as policymakers, you in the audience, I'm sure, are looking for tangible policy changes that can be made, both big and small, that can have an enormous impact on solving this rural broadband issue. And my sincere hope today is that the whole panel and I will be able to provide some of those policy decisions or issues for you to consider as you tackle this such an important issue. I do think it's important, and I know Katie did this a little bit, and I'm going to do it a little bit too, which is to start the conversation focused on positive steps that have already been taken to solve this rural broadband gap. Thanks to the efforts of Congress and state governments and a favorable regulatory environment at the FCC that's been fostered by the FCC, and most importantly, the extensive investment in infrastructure by companies like Charter, a substantial portion of the country has access to high-speed broadband. If you look at just 10 years ago, few parts of the country had access to even 4 megabits per second down in its speeds, let alone the high speeds that we're seeing that are so much more commonplace today. And in fact, if we put up all of the slides already up, if you look, in just the last 2 years, and I think Vanessa in her introduction talked about this a little bit too, Charter alone has built out our network to more than 1.5 million unserved or underserved homes and businesses, and approximately 30% of that is in rural areas. And the majority of the homes and businesses we serve today have starting speeds of 200 megabits per second, which is 25 times faster than our flagship speeds just 10 years ago. And in fact, we have access to gig broadband speeds across virtually our entire footprint. So something we're very proud of. But at the same time, look, despite these efforts, I think we at Charter, and I think everybody on today's panel recognizes that there are millions of Americans that are still without adequate broadband service. And this is especially true in rural communities where the cost, as I think everybody has already mentioned, the cost of building a broadband network to these areas is just exceptionally high. And I think what you'll see, and you've already probably heard, is that there are really many factors that can raise this cost to serving these rural communities. And there's probably no one silver bullet to solving this problem. Rather, I think many factors need to be considered. And we're going to talk about these factors. We've already started to talk about some, but each of these factors, I think, are increasing the cost of trying to serve an area that's already very expensive to serve. And tackling some of these issues can help reduce that cost and then accelerate broadband deployment into rural areas. So we've already talked about one increasing cost is this complicated process for obtaining permission to attach to poles. For a company like Charter, it's attaching our cables to these poles in order to serve rural areas. And if the pole application or the pole replacement process or the rental fees associated with it drive up the cost, it's that much harder to serve a rural area. And we'll talk a little bit more about some steps afoot at the FCC to hopefully address this issue. And there are other factors too, which some have talked about this ETC requirement. I think of that requirement as that and others that we'll talk about as possibly changes that need to be considered in order to encourage broadband providers to participate in already existing programs or new government programs that are intended to incentivize broadband deployment. You don't want to have a government program set up that somehow discourages some of the best broadband providers in the country from being able to participate. And so those programs need to be looked at, whether they're new or old, and kind of evaluated as to whether they're really encouraging participation by the broadband providers best equipped to participate. I think, I'll end up here real quick and just say Charter wants to be a part of this solution to closing the rural broadband gap. We're going to continue to build out our network to reach more unserved communities, especially in rural areas. And it's always been a priority for our company. But I would say that this COVID crisis has really supercharged the urgency of getting this gap closed once and for good. And we do believe that with reasonable policy changes to address the high costs associated with deploying in rural areas, the reach and impact of our private capital and scarce government resources will go that much further and get broadband to more Americans faster. Thanks a lot, Joanna.
Great, thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that the panelists collectively have both laid out kind of comprehensive roadmaps of how we can accelerate and ensure rural broadband deployment, as well as identifying some very specific things. One common theme throughout was really the impact of poles and the cost of pole attachment on rural broadband deployment. So I wanted to turn to Michelle and ask her about this issue of pole replacement. So if I am a provider that wants to serve a new area and I need to attach to an existing network of poles, I only have one option. We don't have multiple sets of poles running down rural routes or any other roads really. And I know that I'm going to confront a pole attachment fee that's reoccurring. But when I seek to attach, I'm told that the pole's really full and for me to, or it's in bad condition. And so for me to attach my network to that pole, it's going to have to be replaced, and that I need to bear the replacement cost. But I won't end up owning the pole. I will just pay for it to be replaced, and then also pay on top of that the reoccurring attachment fee. How should we approach the concept of pole replacement, and who should bear what cost of that?
Well, I mean, I think the FCC has already discussed some of this, and the petition ahead is looking at this issue, but certainly it should not be the responsibility of an attacher to bear 100% of the replacement cost, especially when a pole has already depreciated significantly. The value of the new pole will be significant to the pole owner as well as other attachers. So that the burden of the cost should be both appropriate in terms of the fact that even if a pole needs to be replaced earlier than it might otherwise have to be replaced, it should only be based on that moving forward of these costs, and the overall cost should still be distributed based on usage, which is oftentimes based on space in previous proceedings. But the key problem we're seeing, or we're observing in the rural areas, is that a lot of the poles, and this seems to be true even throughout the US, many poles are kind of reaching their peak age. And so utilities are oftentimes saying, well, for safety reasons or whatever, we need to, if you wish to attach, we need to replace them. But this is something that they would have had to do anyways, or eventually do it fairly soon. So it's creating a much higher demand for replacing poles in the rural areas when deployment is occurring and attachment is being requested. And right now, the burden is being disproportionately placed on the broadband provider who's seeking to attach, and which is the reason for the NCTA petition going forward, and which makes a lot of sense.
Great, thank you. Mark, Michelle referred to an example of just a kind of very high pole cost situation that your company faced in looking in a particular area. Can you speak more to the process of looking at an area in which to expand, and how important are pole costs to your company?
Sure. No, poll costs, and hopefully, we haven't lost anybody yet here when we're talking about polls, because it sounds really kind of technical and boring. But hopefully, everybody listening today will walk away thinking and recognizing how important it is, because it's a huge issue for Charter in terms of costs and costs of build out. And I think if you just think about it, for a company like Charter, when we're looking to serve, let's say, an urban area, given that urban area's population and density and geography, typically a utility pole in an urban area is going to serve, one pole is going to serve about, let's say, 10 customers. Now think about a rural area. You've got a lot more open space, a lot more distance between the homes, and consequently, a lot more utility poles that you're going to need to attach to if you're going to get your cable and that broadband service to that customer. And in fact, in some rural areas, it can take 10 poles to serve one customer. So, I think that's all to say utility poles really do matter and are a huge, huge factor in build-out decisions, in particular in rural areas. If accessing a pole takes too long, or if broadband providers such as, as Michelle kind of mentioned, are asked to cover more than their fair share of costs associated with getting onto that pole, or are asked to pay the full cost to replacing, broadband deployment is just impaired. I mean, it's plain and simple. And, to give you an idea of how big this issue, we've seen pole-related costs make up as much as almost a third of our cost in a broadband expansion project. So it's a very, very important issue for us. And it's one, just for 1 second, I want to mention that this is something that Congress recognized, and when it passed a law several years ago, and the FCC implemented rules to effectuate that law, Congress looked and said, look, the polls are important, and so we're going to have a process by which companies can attach to those polls, and we're going to do it in a fair and equitable way so that poll owners should be compensated for the fair use of their polls by attachers, while attaching companies should not be denied access to those polls in some way unfairly or saddled with excessive costs. And it was a careful balancing that Congress tried to reach here. Unfortunately, as some have already talked about, despite that law and the FCC's rules on the issue, we've seen, at least the Charter, and I know others have experienced, other broadband providers have experienced this as well. We've just seen that too much of the costs associated with polls, poll attachments, but in particular poll replacement costs, have been pushed to the broadband providers in a way that's just not just and reasonable as Congress intended, or as the FCC's current rules actually allow for. So we're very much supportive of this petition that NCTA has filed to have the FCC come out and look at this issue, particularly on poll replacements, to get things back in equilibrium so that attachment costs and poll replacement costs in particular are just and reasonable again, which will only accelerate broadband deployment. So we're hopeful that the FCC is going to take action on this quickly, because we really think it could jumpstart broadband deployment in rural areas.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to ask one more question to Brian, Marita, and Katie. It won't be like a congressional hearing back in the day when Mr. Dingle would give you, you can only answer yes or no. You'll have a little bit more time, but I do want to open up the floor after that question to our participants. So the question is, you all have spent a lot of time working on and thinking about how best to serve rural communities and do it faster. If there were one thing that you wish that members would think more about other than the money, what would it be? And certainly appropriating funding for rural broadband deployment is very, very important. But a lot of this conversation is what can government do other than the money? So I'm going to start with you, Brian, and then we'll go to Katie and Marita, and then head to the audience.
Great. Thank you, Joanna. So thank you for the question. I think what I'll say in response will kind of sound a lot of the similar themes that some of the other panelists have already shared in their remarks. But from what we've seen, government can take steps to move the needle on broadband deployment without spending a dime by being diligent about removing regulatory barriers that drive up the cost of a build. So as other panelists have explained, broadband deployment is a highly capital-intensive endeavor. It relies on access to critical infrastructure, including public and private rights-of-way. We've talked quite a bit about poles, also ducts, conduits, crossing railroads. Federal law, there's a framework in place for getting access to poles and other utility-owned infrastructure on a reasonable and non-discriminatory basis. And the FCC has done a lot of work in the last few years, devoted a lot of attention to addressing barriers to accessing infrastructure on those terms. And ACA Connects is where we were also supportive of the NCTA petition on pole replacements. This is a problem for our members as well. These smaller broadband providers out in rural America, sort of being hit with these excessive, unreasonable pole replacement costs, can really undermine the business case for a new build, especially when you're going into a more rural, more unserved area that's more sparsely populated. There's fewer customers to kind of just to carry, to make the return on the investment. Those pole replacement costs can really have an impact. So there's been a lot of work at the FCC and elsewhere to address barriers, but we kind of have seen that sort of for every barrier that gets knocked down, the new one seems to crop up. which makes it more expensive to deploy networks and to reach unserved areas. So I think it's just a matter of FCC and Congress maintaining vigilance and redoubling their efforts to quickly identify and address barriers to deployment. We've talked a bit about the pole. We've talked quite a bit about pole attachments and the pole replacements issue in particular. As I alluded to, ACA Connects members have also, and many of them have reported problems crossing railroad rights of way just to get from one side of the railroad to the other to deploy their network. So that's another issue where some efforts to streamline or move that barrier would facilitate deployment. Another issue I'll talk about briefly is we've had members find that they've had problems quickly making their service drops to individual customer locations. So this is like the lighter weight wire that actually connects from the pole to the customer's residence. Sometimes when you make those drops, the provider has to attach the wire first to additional utility poles. Just sometimes it's necessary to sort of maintain the ground clearance if you're going across the street or something like that. It's common practice to do those drop attachments do the attachment and then notify the utility. They're lighter weight wires. They don't have the sort of impact on pole loading and safety that a normal attachment would have. So it's sort of a reasonable practice. But some of our members have faced utilities that require them to provide advance notice or even approval before they do those sort of adjunct drop attachments, which isn't consistent with commercial reality. When you sign up a new customer, they expect to get connected quickly. Some of our members do same day installs. So that's just another example of a barrier we've seen crop up to connecting new customers. So that's just some examples there.
Great, Brian. I've heard from some of our members some pretty dramatic examples of the difficulty of getting access to cross a railroad. And it's not really a question of when, it's just kind of never. We're not even going to respond sometimes to the request. Exactly. And when you think about in a lot of small towns, the railroad may cut through and, the plant can be on one side or
right.
Needs to get to the other, and it just doesn't happen.
Can't really go around it. So exactly.
Yeah. All right, Katie, how about you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, those are great examples about streamlining a permitting process and putting a shot clock in place that, could be done at congressional, FCC, or state level. Those are really great examples. I'll go back to, and Marita mentioned this too, expanding opportunities for Broadband Deployment Act, which eliminates that eligible telecommunications carrier requirement. It doesn't make sense now. It may have made sense when all we had was plain old telephone service, copper wires, and dial-up. But that's not what we're dealing with now, and that's not what people want. People want just broadband. So getting rid of that requirement, and I think employing those competitive reverse auctions are some of the best things that can be done that doesn't touch any kind of spending at all. That gets a lot more people involved. It enhances a competitive process, and it's just really what people want. On the and then the other thing I would, of course, mention is just considering if there's any kind of tax reform or tax issues in front of anyone considering capital expenditures, because really that is the deployment, getting the fiber in the ground, stringing the wires on the poles, getting the poles up. There's a huge expense to deploy this infrastructure. So reducing that burden on carriers will help when they are deploying in those spaces. So those are just pretty simple things to be done that don't really touch a financial issue.
I think on the ETC, or the eligible telecommunications requirement, I just want to make sure that our participants understand that in order to participate in USF programs, you do need to have this designation from states that require it. There are a number of states that don't, which I think is part of the proof of the antiquated nature of the requirement. States have said we don't need to do this anymore. There's some that still are, but we really need to take a look at this and try to eliminate it. This is one thing that would have to be done by statute, so it's longer term, but very important to address. Marita, you're on mute.
I would say that we need to focus like a laser beam on the economically depressed rural areas first. And a lot of the things we've discussed today all can be ways that is addressed, whether it's the NCTA petition to keep from, adding all the additional costs of a pole replacement onto broadband providers, or whether it's Congressman Butterfield's bill, which would enable smaller ISPs and others to participate. And even though, as Katie said, they may not, not everyone wants the plain old telephone service anymore, and it's not necessary to impose that antiquated requirement on small carriers in particular. But just in general, just from our standpoint, there are a lot of things that are going on. There's voucher programs out there and a broadband benefit program that would provide direct subsidies to low-income people to make sure that they can get connected or stay connected, and just a number of other things. But I would say our number one thing would be to ask policymakers to, whatever you do, focus on the economically depressed rural areas first.
Right, I think we could all support that. All right, Nilda, let's open it up to participant questions.
Sure. Thank you, Joanna. In the interest of time, we're having to condense a few. And for those of you that are still in the chat with questions, we will be certain to direct those to the panelists. This question is for Brian Hurley or Mark Paul. It's a question about a myriad of government programs to help bring broadband to unserved, usually rural areas. Just at the federal level, the FCC has USF, CAF, and soon RDOF, and the USDA has at least 7 or 8 different programs. Should policymakers, or what are your thoughts as to whether policymakers should be concerned about how many different programs there are? And what in particular should policymakers strive to ensure in order for the programs to do the most good? And it looks like that question can be directed to Brian, Mark, or anyone else on the panel that would like to answer.
So I mean, I have a couple quick thoughts, and Brian, feel free to jump in. I mean, I think, one of the things that I said in my intro remarks is how I would respond to that question, which is any government program intending to support broadband really should look as a threshold matter as to whether it is attracting those broadband providers that are best equipped and most interested in providing broadband service, and actually best positioned to provide broadband service in certain rural areas of the country. And I think certain existing programs have certain barriers, some of which we've talked about, this ETC requirement, that discourage certain broadband providers from participating. I think the questioner raised the rural utilities service programs at Department of Agriculture. Well, not to get all into the weeds on this, but there are certain application requirements for the RUS programs that have long discouraged certain national publicly held broadband providers from even participating or applying, or making it really difficult to apply, which only results in these well-positioned broadband providers from saying, I'm not going to bother, or I'm not going to participate in that program. And at the end of the day, rural communities suffer from that. But I think you can make simple changes in the application requirement process at RUS, or certain transparency changes can be made in the RUS process that are going to encourage providers to participate. So it's not necessarily looking at too many programs that government may have, but what are those programs, and are they actually attracting the right participants?
And I'll jump in just to sort of build on some of the things Mark was saying. So That's a great question. It's something, we've been thinking about sort of how to effectively target federal support, especially when you have multiple agencies that are in the mix. From our view, there are some lessons learned that we've taken from the programs we've seen in the past and that are underway now. And one of those we think is that the program should be carefully structured to identify locations that are actually unserved, both to ensure that you actually reach those locations and also to avoid overbuilding areas where there's a cable company or another broadband provider that's willing to make the private investment to serve that area. We often talk about overbuilding in terms of, a government program not overbuilding the private sector, but you also want to make sure government programs aren't overbuilding one another. There's, that's just a matter of efficient use of federal funds and distribution of support. That if there's multiple agencies with different programs, they're sort of harmonized so that program, that problem is avoided. And another important principle is that we should be, regardless of which agency is administering the support, we should be looking to build the networks of tomorrow. In the past, not too long ago, federal funding, supporting networks that provide 4 megabits download speeds, 1 megabit upload speeds. That level of service isn't going to get you very far today. Probably wouldn't work for all of us on this Zoom conference call today. So, and we can only expect that consumers' broadband appetites will continue to grow. So, as we're sort of thinking through the future and developing new programs, we should keep that in mind. And we should, for ACA Connects, we applaud the FCC for actually moving in that direction with its Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And I'll just one final thing I'll just mention is that in order to ensure that the funding is going to providers that are kind of the best positioned to provide the service, we support the use of reverse auctions, kind of similar mechanisms that reward money on a competitive basis. The Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction at the FCC was kind of a proof of concept of that idea. We think it was successful, and we're pleased the FCC is building on that success with its Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction that's they're in the midst of working towards that. So that's from our perspective, that's a model that works, and we should look to refine and improve upon it going forward. So.
Great. Thank you very much to our participants and to our panelists. I think if I were going to summarize this in a few bullet points, I would say really we want to start from the outlook of, as Marita says, how do we focus on the most economically depressed areas and bring them forward by deploying broadband in their communities? And in order to do that, we need mapping. I think the FCC's done their part. We need Congress to appropriate the funding. We are all in violent agreement that there are areas that need broadband, and they're only going to get it with some assistance from the government. And so then the question is, how do we provide that assistance? And we need programs that are structured well. One top line on structuring is reverse auctions. Another issue is making sure that all of the providers who might want to serve an area are actually eligible to participate in these government programs. And one example of what's needed there is eliminating the ETC requirement. And, as Michelle walked us through at the beginning, we need to reduce the deployment cost as well. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the deployment costs really affect the initial decision of a provider to say, hey, I want to go into that area, I want to bid in that auction. And then two, the better job we do at reducing deployment costs, the more funding will be available, both private capital and government resources to go to other unserved areas, and also to try to tackle the adoption issues. And there, we've heard a variety of issues regarding streamlining of permitting, access to rights of ways, and a lot of talk today on the cost of accessing polls. And so to that end, I would like to close with a plug for the NCTA petition pending at the FCC regarding the allocation of pole cost and to take a look at that and clarify what's fair. So with that, I'll close and thank everybody for your participation.